Hi, this is Kenny Shue, your host of the Inconvenient Minority Podcast. Now, we're going to bring in guest James Lindsay on the show. He's a best-selling author and commentator. He's the author of Cynical Theories. It's a bestseller, and it's going to be a very different sort of interview from those who've listened to Lindsay's interviews a lot. I'm going to ask him a lot about his cultural upbringing in Tennessee on the outskirts of what he calls redneck white culture. James, great to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kenny.
Absolutely. James, you have a unique story. You were raised in upstate New York, in a region that you described as being a place where your folk would shoot deer and have lots of kids.
That's right.
Mind if you expand a little bit on how you were raised and in that kind of culture and environment?
It's really, I did have a peculiar kind of upbringing. So my family, I guess I should actually kind of start with my parents. My parents are from kind of two different worlds, culturally speaking.
Yeah.
My dad is from Western New York, grew up middle class, educated, so he's kind of in that world. And most of his family was educated professionals and so on. And my mother is actually from a very rural area in far northern New York that is kind of partly mountainous with the Adirondack Mountains and partly swampy with the St. Lawrence waterway right by there. And so there was actually a factory. My dad worked for the aluminum company Alcoa for a large number of years. And there's actually an Alcoa factory in northern New York where he worked. And so it happened to be near where my mother was from. And so I grew up in this small town that's surrounded by a large amount of rural New York for the first few years of life. And then my dad got a job transfer to East Tennessee, which is obviously, we're right in the Tennessee Valley. The factory there, the reason is because it's in the Tennessee Valley. So the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority dams, provide huge amounts of hydroelectric power, which you need huge amounts of electric power to do aluminum smelting. So there's a factory here. So I moved from, sort of northern Appalachia swampland to southern Appalachia as a child. And then being that my mom kind of comes from this very kind of rural sort of family tradition, like you said, lots of kids shooting deer, the whole thing. Like I grew up and when I was young, it wasn't too much for me, but most of the family, extended family, there was a lot of eating deer and fish and things that were hunted and caught because they were poor enough where you couldn't really buy meat. And so, it was how many deer can you get, how many fish can you catch, and you keep them in big chest freezers and, buy potatoes. And that's the basis of all your meals for the entire year. And so, there's this huge kind of family vibe with those kinds of cultures where it's seen as kind of a betrayal of the family to move away. So my mom ends up moving away with my dad when he gets his transfer down here to Tennessee. And so we went back up there. The point of that being that we went back up to live as much of the year as possible with my mom's family. So I kind of lived in the South and in the North, but in kind of an Appalachian context in both circumstances. Though my mom's family, where they live, it's not so much Appalachian culture. It's partly Appalachian and partly just straight up Canadian. Their accent is actually more Canadian than anything else. So I grew up kind of with a foot in a lot of different worlds. I was going to one of the better high public schools in East Tennessee, or in Tennessee in general, growing up. So, but I lived in.
But you had one foot in the mountainous Tennessee world.
Well, yeah, I even lived outside of. I went to a city school, but I lived outside of the city. So I went to city school with all of the. It used to be a thing. It was all the yuppies and whatever go to the city schools. And I lived in the county, so I came home and all of my friends are these little BB gun shooting, rootin' tootin', running around in the woods, rednecks, and this is what we did. And we went fishing, and the whole thing. Um, and it was like having a lot of different culture going on all at once. So I had this weird position where I was sort of like outsider within, kind of occupying that educated professional culture on the one side and kind of occupying that Appalachian culture on the other, and then also having the different perspectives of northern and southern, and the whole thing kind of mixing together.
So you have a unique perspective because you have one foot in both the educated culture, but also one foot in what J.D. Vance popularized as hillbilly culture, dancing outlaw culture.
Dancing outlaw, yeah. Yeah. I mean,
But,
I don't know the dancing outlaw guy, but I do know people like that, or have known people like that. I grew up, one of my best friends when I was a kid, his dad could basically be that guy. I can tell you some crazy stories about what that guy had to say about the world. So,
but you first of all, let's give compliments where they're due. What would you say is a compliment? Is something that the mountain culture that you were involved with is something that you would find honorable or complimentary that other cultures don't necessarily have as much of?
I mean, they are very down to earth people, and they're very family oriented people. And I don't mean that just in the sense of, oh, you got mom, dad, and the kids, nuclear family. I mean, they tend to have a very extended family kind of culture that's extremely important. In fact, I would argue, in some sense, too important. And they tend to have an abundance of what you might refer to as just plain sense or common sense. And they value that kind of plain common sense very highly. They tend to have a lot of what people might refer to as down home values. They often care a tremendous amount about people in the community that they're embedded within. So there are lots of kind of locally pro-social values. They tend to value hard work. They tend to value, making the best, and that's probably the bigger one, is making the best of what they have without complaining too much about it.
Yeah, I see. At the same time, though, we were talking before, and you were saying they're almost like the reverse model majority. If the Asian Americans are the model minority, and you say they have they value hard work, and you say they value and having a good extended family and those kinds of things. Then what? A lot of people look down upon them, consider them as lower on the social ladder than other people. What potentially holds them back, or what do you think about that characterization?
Well, it's like I said just a moment ago. There's a number of things, but one of the things is that I said that they almost have too much of a family value, and that's true in the sense that they will place loyalty to family above something else, like getting educated or taking a good job opportunity or whatever. And it'll be loyalty not only to family but to region. It was considered a huge scandal when in the family, when my mom moved down here with us, and that of course created this very complicated situation where we were driving with the speed limits back in the 80s. It was an 18-hour drive back and forth between the places. We were doing this like 5 times a year, just brutal car drives. Like road trips all the time. And so, other members of the family literally were kind of pressured not to go to college, or only go to go to 2-year school. Or if you can't go to the most local school, then don't go because you're leaving the family. And it was framed as this kind of betrayal of family, betrayal of locality. And so there's like this almost, I don't know what's it's almost like codependency of family problem that arises. And when I say that they value hard work, there's almost an excess of valuing hard work, because they would rather do something in many cases the hard way than the reasonable, easy way. Like rather than, it's not the same, but an extreme of that would be like the Amish, where there's this we're going to put up the barn by hand. We're not going to use any machines, and electricity is not going to be involved. It's not like that, of course, but there's this emphasis on, well, the old way worked. And even if it's like really hard, we're not going to use some newfangled thing. So that you have this kind of Luddite, anti-progress sort of attitude. And then there's also that these kind of things combine to where there is a distrust. I said, it's not just about family that causes them to distrust education or sending kids off to school or whatever, like
Yeah.
college. It's also a distrust of education that is rife, and a distrust of going off to the city to get a job. It's taken anything that's like genuine progress that takes you away from the old ways can be seen in a very negative light. And so you do have this situation that, like you said, where Asians are often, because of their high levels of success and everything else, are often, and their cultural values are often labeled as a model minority. Like white people appreciate Asians because they fit the right model of how a minority should be. And it's like Appalachian whites are sort of like your like anti-model majority is like they're the opposite of what you would normally brand, or what you see as branded as whiteness culture, and I think that these things lead to people, not wrongly, but not fairly, if you follow me, looking down on and criticizing so-called hillbilly culture, stereotype accuracy being what it is. It's not fair to lean into stereotypes, but they're also not totally wrong. They are speaking to something in a kind of blurry, statistical way that has worth. And I think that those are some of the causes. The resistance to progress, and the emphasis on kind of that. The way I would phrase it actually is cultural protectionism. They have a culture, that culture they feel like should not change. So they become very protectionist of that culture. And I think that's sort of the heart of the problem, because if as the other culture shifts and moves and changes and develops, if you're unwilling to change with it, then you set yourself up in a bad place.
That's interesting that you described that. As a Chinese American, growing up in my culture, placed a very high value on education. Mm-hmm. In fact, there are a lot of poor Chinese Americans right now who place all of their bets for their children on their education, in the sense that they want their kid to get the best grades and have the highest test scores so they can go to that college. And then and in some ways, that's how they view social mobility, through education.
Right. And for good reason, for truly good reason.
So maybe what's happening in this culture that you're talking about with this anti-model majority culture is they're placing their bets on maybe something that isn't bearing as much fruit for them.
Yeah, definitely. They're placing their bets on kind of sticking together, maintaining the old traditional way. Because I mean, life, when these patterns, these cultural values were developed, life was a lot different, and it was really a lot harder in a lot of ways. And so you have like really tough people with a lot of fiber to them, having figured out how to live in a circumstance that was very difficult. And then there's this fear of losing that way. And to see things like education and progress and, city life and so on as being inherently inimical to that way of life becomes sort of the issue.
Yeah. Which kind of brings me to this interesting question. We talk about, and I hear this a lot in conservative circles. We talk about hard work. Hard work is what helps people to breed success. And I mean, in one sense, that's true, because no one successful has ever gotten there with hard work unless they inherited something. Mm-hmm. But in another sense, you raise an interesting point, which is that these people work really hard, but in a sense, they're not working smart.
Yeah, exactly. That's often the case. And both of those things are relevant, right? It's like you do have to work
Mhm.
hard and you do have to work smart.
Yeah.
And another side of that, by the way, just as a kind of a tangent, is that hard work isn't
Sure.
a guarantor of success. It's a precondition of success. A lot of people, there's this attack on the meritocracy, and they're like, oh, we don't live in a meritocracy. If we did, people who work really hard would automatically, get somewhere. But no, that's not what happens. If you work really, really hard at something pointless, you don't get anywhere.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can think of, you could just think of like the silliest behavior in the world that achieves nothing, like,
Yeah.
I don't know, doing cartwheels or something. And if you worked really hard at doing the best cartwheels or at drawing the best hand turkey, or, some absolutely ridiculous thing that has no particular value, hopping on one leg, you could become the world's greatest hop on one leg person, and it's not going to get you anywhere. And you could put in 15 hours a day to the effort. It's just, it doesn't produce anything. So there is a necessity to work smart, and to work smart in accordance with the situation that you're in. So if you're working hard according to the standards that worked in, say, 1940 or 1935 or something like that, coming out of the Depression, which is very kind of probably the most relevant time for this situation, and you're not working for the way that works in 2020, you're not working efficiently. And in fact, you might be putting a lot of effort into producing something that nobody wants, or that doesn't get you anywhere. Um, and it is possible to put a lot of wasted effort into, so I had a friend, and I like this guy. And so he had this belief that, like, he's a Southern guy. And so he had this
Yeah.
belief that real work didn't use power tools. And so then he creates this like handyman
Huh.
construction business, but it's like,
Mhm.
his thing is, we do everything by hand. We don't use power tools. They had no nail guns. They had no power saws. And, they did reasonably good work, but it
Yeah.
takes forever to cut 2x4s with a box saw. It takes forever. It's so much work. And then their business failed ultimately because they were charging
Uh-huh.
labor by the hour in addition to materials, as
Yeah.
normally happens. But their labor took like
Right.
10 times as long because they're sitting there with hammers and
Mhm.
like hand saws and things like this, where
Yeah.
anybody who's just going to use a power saw is just going to, and a nail gun is going to outcompete them on their labor costs. And so they're
Right.
working harder, and they had this value, though, that there was something more pure and more real about work that was done purely by hand, except it doesn't produce a product that anybody had. It's like, if you saw the board by hand, not only, as a matter of fact, does it take you much longer and much more work, but usually you're not going to cut as precisely as if you just use the machine. The machine actually produces a better result in both ways. And so this is a great example of where somebody can confuse themselves, where they get some kind of a value that's not in concert with the actual objective. Like, there's this mythical value to, we did all the work by hand, but mythical value is not like real value. And so there's this
Yeah.
problem that can come up there. And, I don't want to like put it that way necessarily about Appalachian culture, but there is a lot of
Yeah.
valuing of hard work that goes kind of nowhere. And
Yeah.
it's a valuing of work that reflects an
Mhm.
older, easier time where a lot of things are being done by hand that don't need to be done by hand, and are,
Yeah.
are kind of a refusal to accept and adapt to progress. Um,
Yeah. It's interesting. That is interesting. You lived on the outskirts of this culture.
mhm.
Yeah. Were you ever tempted by it?
I mean, it's fun to hang out. It's very
Yeah.
difficult. It's fun to hang out
Yeah.
with people who have a little bit of this, and so, I was certainly friends with
Mhm.
these people, and still
Yeah.
am friends with people that are kind of connected to it. But there's a
Yeah.
difference between like kind of Appalachian culture and like redneck
Yeah.
culture, and then,
Yeah.
if we want to draw a line, proper hillbilly
Right.
culture. And that is extraordinarily exclusive. It's like, it's harder to join that than it is to become like a Jew or something, which is a hard religion to convert to. I'm not bringing it up in anything about Jews, except that it's hard to convert to Judaism. Um, it's You have to be accepted. Like, when I grew up here, there were places that you didn't go. There were regions kind of in the hills. you didn't go unless you went with somebody who lived there. So we had this group of friends who lived, I don't want to name any places or whatever specifically, but they lived in one of these.
Yeah.
They have names that are very, like, it's not a real one, but they're named places like Frog Holler, like like for real. And so, we'll pretend it's called Frog Holler where these folks lived. And the deal was very, very clear. Like if we went to their house for dinner or whatever, we were friends with them, they came and picked us up because we had to go in their car. Because if an unknown car was showing up in Frog Holler, there's a good chance it would leave with shotgun holes in it. And there was that. So it's very it's not that way. I don't run into that now, but 40 years ago, even, or 30 years ago, it was extraordinarily exclusive. It was very difficult. I did, however, date a woman in college who was part of this culture, whose family is part of this culture, and she was sort of trying to escape it. She was in college. That's where I met her, and she was trying to escape it. And I don't think in the end she achieved the escape velocity. She did graduate with her degree, but then got pulled back to the mountain, as they referred to it. And I spent a lot of time there with her and her family and their community and at their church. And I was never really welcome. And I was always kind of content with not being welcome. It's like, this is not how I want to live my life. So I don't think I can honestly say I was properly tempted by it, even when the rewards of a romantic relationship were hanging in the balance, as it turned out.
Really interesting to hear, because you kind of were on the boundaries, and obviously you're a more intellectual person, and the anti-intellectualism there, probably didn't help.
Well, I can give you a couple of quick stories. Like one time we went to the church, and the young nephew, he's 2 or 3 at the time or something, the moon is up, and he says, "How does the moon fly?" Some question a toddler asks, and one of the I guess the matriarch of the family replies, "Because Jesus wants it to. Jesus made it do it." And then I just got this look that said as plainly as any words, "If you dare say a word." I was majoring in physics, by the way. Like, if you dare say a word, it's going to be your head. And so, that kind of anti-intellectualism was definitely there. It's like, you're not going to challenge the religious value that Jesus makes the moon fly, as opposed to just talking about orbital dynamics. I don't know how you do that to a 3-year-old, but I was 20, so I was ready for the challenge, I'm sure. And then,
well, in a sense, though, it's just interesting you bring up that example, though, because in a sense, though, assuming the schema of Christianity is correct, I mean, they're not wrong. I mean, assuming the scheme of Christianity is correct, God does make the moon fly. It just doesn't delve in, I guess, into the intellectual or scientific caliber that maybe you wanted to explore.
And there are ways to reconcile these ideas, but certainly I was not to add detail. And then just to kind of like round it out, when this young woman and I broke up, the reason given was that she broke up with me. The reason she gave was, "You don't belong on the mountain and I have to stay here." And so it was clearly, our cultures are not the same, and I can't go with you, and you can't be trapped here. Was the reason that relationship, 3 years, that relationship, which was all positive, eventually fell apart. That cultural, it was like, the old, was it Billy Joel as the Uptown Girl or whoever it is? It was very much like that. It's like I'm dating the girl from the wrong side of the tracks, or maybe I'm on the wrong side of the tracks or something. Kind of vibe to it. But so, like I said, there's this kind of cultural protectionism, and it was clear that I didn't fit into that culture. I was of educated type. I didn't belong there, and it wouldn't be satisfying. She recognized it would not be satisfying for me to have to live that life, and that it wouldn't be satisfying for her to have to leave it. So she did not achieve escape velocity, if we want to phrase it that way, to get out of the gravitational pull of the mountain or the culture. And I think that this is a relevant dynamic that you see kind of all over the place.
Yeah, that's So the mountain won.
The mountain won that one, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that happens a lot. And like I said to you before, I think that connects to, other patterns that we see in
Right.
cultural dynamics right now. And so I think that the reason that it's interesting to talk about this Appalachian stuff is that the Appalachian stuff disrupts these kind of prevalent narratives, because there is no racial dimension in the South between Appalachian whites and not Appalachian whites. The race isn't the question. There is a cultural barrier, however, and there's something going on there. And I think that it disrupts the so-called woke narrative in a profound way, it's like the mirror image way or the inverse way that the Asian model minority issue disrupts their narrative. Or it could, we mention Asians, but it could be Nigerians. It could be, when I say Asian, I'm terrible. I tend to mean East Asian. So it could also be South Asian. It could be Jews, as a matter of fact, even, ethnic groups that have high levels of success in, as the woke phrase it, white cultures, because of something, like maybe valuing the crap out of education.
Yeah. And this brings me, to what we were talking about a little earlier about education. Asian Americans, we place our bets on getting a good education, I think, largely. It leads us to sacrifice a few things. It doesn't mean that, we just win at life because we get a better education. Oftentimes, we're referred to as the nerds in school. We don't succeed as much in culture in America today, especially in politics and those kinds of things. That's changing a little bit. But if you want to, how I phrased it in my book is, if you want to get to, the top 30% of society, Asian values is a great way to do that.
Right. Yeah. It's, like a good example, I know lots of Chinese people, friends with I have lots of Chinese friends. And I say that to point out that I know that the Chinese freaking love, and I don't know why actually, but they freaking love basketball, like NBA. You go to China, they don't speak English, but they're all like, they see a tall person and they point, they're like NBA. And you're like, whoa, okay. So you don't see a lot of Asians, and Asians, of course, Chinese people can be quite tall, of course. A lot of people associate Asian and short, but you look, that's more of a Japanese stereotype than it is a cross Asian stereotype. But Asians are actually famous throughout history for their physical prowess and skill and ability to master, techniques, the whole martial arts thing. And so it's not a lack of the ability to learn to play basketball and learn to play basketball extremely well. It's not a lack of interest in basketball. And the height thing on average maybe is a thing, but there are very tall Asian people. Yao Ming, for example, is like 7 feet tall or something, so, and he played NBA, of course. So there's no reason to think that it's any of these things. But if you're not placing your bet on the basketball court, you're not playing basketball as often as you're studying, you're going to end up having different results in terms of what proportion of people are ending up, in the highly competitive sporting arena versus, the, medical doctor arena, for example. So I think that this where you place your bets thing is really significant. And I think it's being underappreciated. In Appalachia, people are placing their bets in the traditional values and the family. And, within Asian cultures, I don't like to stereotype, but it's true that nearly every Asian person I know either strongly values education or their parents strongly value it for them. And, the Tiger Mom thing, and you just have to deal with it. And, if you're being forced to study hard, and you will end up doing well in things that are the result of having had high levels of educational attainment, whereas you will probably proportionally have fewer people rolling around in the NBA or even in a sport where height's less relevant, like professional tennis or something like that.
Right. Which brings me to the point about culture, right? There's this narrative right now about white privilege and increasingly Asian privilege as well, that because of your race, this is why you succeed. And I think what we, as you were saying before, what this Appalachian culture, in contrast with the Asian American culture, which is a minority, we're people of color, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And we're contrasted with this white Appalachian culture over here. I think we both inconvenience that narrative.
I think so.
Right?
Yeah, definitely. Because Asian people, I'm not huge into the whole like race thing, but Asian people and white people are not. I mean, I'll even confess. Yeah, the first time I went to China, I've been to China. This is a funny story to me. People think I'm a huge racist because of this, but it's like the first time I went to China, that's a 14-hour flight, right? And if you've never had a 14-hour flight, the first time you take one, it blitzes you. Like I was on the plane, and if you've ever been on a like long flight, transcontinental or transatlantic or transoceanic in general, you hit this point where you're like, man, I really want off this plane. And you're like, it's 6 hours or so, or 8 hours or whatever. So the first, I hit this point knowing that flight's going to be long. And I hit this point on the plane. It's like, God, I got to get off this plane. And I looked at the time remaining like map thing that was on the screen in front of me. And it was like time remaining in flight, like 9 hours and 11 minutes. I was like, oh God, they're like, this is a long flight. So I get off the plane deliriously tired in Beijing. And I look around and it just pops into my head, thoughts pop into your head. And like, here's my implicit bias gang. And I was like, man, there are a lot of Asian people here. Right? And then really? China, of course.
Yeah.
So it's like,
really?
But the point is, it's like there's something noticeably different between white and Asian if you want to just talk about superficial characteristics that you can obviously see. Right. And so the idea that, we're going to now say, oh, well, it's racism that's holding certain people back. And then you have to start kind of creating this. You have this model, and you have to start creating all these complicated epicycles. Well, Asian's a different race. Why are they succeeding? South Asian, Indian, they're succeeding. Nigerians, they're like really dark black usually. They're succeeding. So you have to start creating these. Oh, white adjacent. Oh, they act white. I was just speaking actually with Zuby, the British rapper, yesterday, and I guess I don't actually know, but by the context, I gather he's of Nigerian origin. Although again, I don't know that, but because he said something about Nigerians, and then he said we. So that's how I'm deriving that. And he said, that we're often accused of acting white. And I know there's an entire book in the critical race literature called Acting White that just goes after black people who act white, in particular Barack Obama. Right. And then they twist it to blame the culture. The culture required Obama to act white in order he couldn't be authentically black. Which when you have people talking like that, like who's really the racist? Like if I were to accuse you of not being authentically Chinese because you're not like in silk right now, and like that'd be horrible, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Why? How on earth is this acceptable? But the truth is that these minorities, the Asian one probably because of their extraordinarily high levels of attainment, and Asian one, there are like tons of Asians of different ethnic backgrounds. I mean, the Chinese are famously split at least into 5 ethnicities, and then Koreans and Japanese and
most of Chinese is Han.
Yeah, most of Chinese is Han. That's the big star on their flag.
Right.
Yeah, the other minority races get to circle around them. Yeah. I know the history of the Chinese flag. So the idea, though, that race is the determining factor here is mostly preposterous. I won't say it's 100% preposterous, but it's mostly preposterous. And the idea that it's not being white is the determining factor is 100% preposterous because South Asians, Jews that don't recognize themselves as white, East Asians, Nigerians, Middle Eastern groups of different descriptions all outperform whites. And so, and I think East Asians are probably at the top of that pile in terms of attainment in the U.S. I don't know the actual statistics of how it breaks down demographically. So this creates a massive, and then you have the Appalachian whites who are underperforming drastically. Or if you look in Britain at the working class white male that are at the bottom of, they're literally at the bottom of society in terms of many dimensions of attainment. Their narrative is completely bogus. The idea that race is the determining factor, that the society is a prevailing racial valence, and then the accordance with that racial valence is the determining factor, that's absolutely absurd. And these groups lay that bare. So this is why you see Asians getting attacked for their Asian privilege and Jewish privilege. And, you reclassified. I talked to a cardiologist who's the son of Indian immigrants. So he's an Indian American. And he was told he's the wrong kind of diversity, because they've been reclassified as white according to some demographic thing, because they're succeeding, and so they must have white values, they must see in white culture. This is so absurd.
Yeah, and in most educational literature today, Asians are classified with white. Like, I was investigating a certain county's school board's classification of the achievement gap, the racial achievement gap, because of course they want to frame it in terms of race. And then they say blacks and Hispanics achieve at a rate of 3.09 grade levels below on these standardized tests than white and Asians. I was like, where did Asians come into this equation? Why are we
Right.
Why are we here? Because we overachieve, and it's just.
Yeah, it's here are the groups in this kind of very crudely drawn way that are doing better, and that's one category, and here are the ones that are doing worse, and that's another category. Therefore, racism, and
therefore, right?
Yeah, and so I mean, and then even like right now within the Latin community, there's this gigantic fight over whether Latinx people, which isn't even a word, Latinx, I guess it's not how you say it. You say Latinx, but I'm just going to start calling them Latinx forever. Which no Latinos, like 98% of Latinos, I think, or 97%, something like that, reject this Latinx terminology. They're like, we're not Latinx or whatever. And like now there's this huge fight. Like, don't forget, just because you're Latinx doesn't mean that you can't be white. And it's like, why? Well, because the ones that are kicking ass are obviously white.
Exactly.
And then what does it mean when you define succeeding as being white, or acting white, or being white adjacent, or being a model minority? What are you implying about everybody else?
And it implies I think you're right, because this increasingly torturous racial narrative, I think, is actually racism. I mean, it increasingly bends towards racism because you are torturing other groups into fitting into the white category of being at the top. Mm-hmm. And then I guess you would suppose people of color, but they don't really mean that. But you are enforcing the idea that white people have to be at the top,
right,
to fit your narrative, ironically.
And that everybody who's up there must somehow be white or connected to whiteness or something like that.
Yeah, in some way.
And so this is where I actually think that the parallel between Appalachia and this whole kind of critical race narrative is so disturbing, and this is why I think they hate hillbilly elegy so much, is because the relevant thing that's happening is that you have a set of cultural values that in and of themselves, I don't want to necessarily say there's something in some cases there are things that are, I think, identifiably wrong with them. In others, I think there's just a matter of preference. And there's some of both of those things happening. But what you have is this kind of cultural protectionism around what they're classifying as capital B politically black. And they want a culture that has different values to have the same outcomes, and to say that if it can't, and if anything and why do I call it cultural protectionism? Because if anybody takes anything from that culture and turns it into something big, that's cultural appropriation. Right. If anybody enjoys it, that's cultural appropriation. So you're not allowed to take anything out of that culture. And then that culture is not allowed to be told that it needs to change. Like maybe if you focused on education at the same level that Asians did, you'd have similar, you can't say things like that. You're not allowed to put that. So there's this cultural protectionism, that there's this wall built around this culture. And I know this is like super dangerous stuff to say, but there's this kind of particular, and it's not black people, it is a particular culture within a certain subgroup of people who are mostly black. Although I think Eminem was an example of somebody who's not black, who had this going on, straight from, what was it? 8 Mile, is that what it's called in Detroit? We have a hillbilly.
8 Mile.
We have a hillbilly places that are also called something Mile, so I get confused. But you're not seeing like when what's happening, and this is the dynamic I want to draw out, is to the degree that there's this relevance to saying, oh, it's cultural racism to say that something to do with so-called urban Black culture is the source of this discrepancy in outcomes. You're not allowed to say that. That's called cultural racism. But if you say the same thing about white Appalachians, that's not cultural racism all of a sudden. And it's like, that's totally okay. And you can make fun of, and I'm not saying you shouldn't make fun of hillbillies, whatever. If you want to, I don't care. I don't care. What I'm worried about here or concerned about here is the double standard. And then I'm not even, I don't care that much about the double standard. What I care about is that the narrative is propped up on a double standard that hides a lie. And so then what happens is you finally have somebody like J.D. Vance come along and humanize the white Appalachians. The people who are bought into this narrative have to go on a full attack and double, like you have a group of people who is not succeeding. They have insane levels of deaths of despair, insane levels of opioid addiction, insane problems. They're the poorest of the poor. There are places I have been in Georgia and Mississippi where it's like worse than third world countries that I've also visited in terms of living standards of white Appalachian people or white Southerners, depending on where you are. Mississippi is not Appalachia. So Georgia is white Appalachia. And so northern Georgia, at least. And so you have the situation where you have people who are in a bad situation. And not only is it okay to trash them and blame their culture, whereas it's not the case where in a parallel circumstance, where the parallels are actually much more profound than people realize. But not only are you allowed to do it, you're allowed to heap extra abuse upon that group. And I'm not here to defend them. I think their values are backwards. I think that the Appalachian culture would do itself a lot of favors to modernize and to find ways to honor. They want to keep hold of the traditions in the family and to find ways to honor those things without the negative attitudes toward progress and technology and education and getting jobs in the cities or whatever else. So I think it should modernize, but I think that I think most importantly that the example that the Appalachians provide lays bare that a similar dynamic is happening somewhere else and it's not allowed to be addressed because it's called cultural racism if you address it.
Last segment here. I want to talk about China. So you go to China every year.
Yeah, Beijing. I've only ever been to Beijing. So
only ever been to Beijing particularly.
Yeah.
So why can you tell the audience why you go to China annually, would you say?
Yeah, I've actually been practicing in Chinese martial arts since 2006. And my teacher lives in Beijing and he hosts a kind of retreat style training intensive every year that I go to. So I go to Beijing once a year, not 2020 for that. Probably not 2021 either. But I've been many years in a row now. I spend a couple of weeks at a time, granted in a kind of cloistered environment. It's not like a monastery. We just are at a hotel. But it's I go there for a martial art. It's not for work. It's not because I have some weird, just fascination with China. I would much rather he came to the U.S. and we trained here, frankly. But he hosts us in Beijing. He doesn't want to leave China, so we go to China once a year. So that's the story behind me going to China.
So, what's your impression of at least of Beijing in terms of culture of excellence?
It's split. It's a very interesting culture. Going to Beijing and was very alarming because you have sort of juxtaposed incredible like kind of culture of excellence and then incredible whatever the exact opposite of that is, like culture of not caring. It's not like what you see in Appalachia or whatever. It's it's the kind of abuse that communism brings on, like that it doesn't matter. It's all just bogus anyway. I remember somebody adapted the Tetris theme song and put words to it, and one of the lyrics is "pointless work for pointless pay," and that's like the essence of communism. And that's that has an effect on people.
Yeah.
Pointless work for pointless
Yeah.
pay, and I've seen the people there who have pointless work for pointless pay. I've also seen, the peasants that they bus into the city to do all the manual labor. There's a term for those that in China is not a bad word, and I would say it, but people flip out if I say it. I would actually be saying it not in the English derogatory translation, which is the exact same sound, but rather in the Chinese. But it translates as bitter work if you know enough Chinese to translate it.
Yeah.
And so I've seen those people, and it's like you can tell that they suffer. Again, it's a kind of communist thing where they're underpaid for what they're expected to do, and they're completely undertrained and unskilled, and that's why their conditions are horrific. These people work brutal. Bitter work is literally what they're called. Like, as people, they're referred to as bitter workers, and they work 12 hours to 13 hours a day, 28 days on, 1 day off, with virtually no safety equipment, like doing construction typically, and or cleaning jobs. And there's no culture of excellence there. But then you look at like the Chinese business people, and you look at the Chinese, the students in university, and there's an insane culture of excellence. The split is almost unbelievable.
Wow.
Between it's like two worlds. In fact, some of my friends, I should say, that live in Beijing, the American friends that live in Beijing, for the same reason, have described China to me as, in a sense, a fourth world country, in that it has first world and third world at the same time. Not to say it's lower than third world, but it's first world and third world at the same time. And so this becomes it's a very peculiar thing, because there are the people who are extremely excellence driven, and then there are the people who are extremely like, not my job, not my problem about everything. And you see both at the same time. Like, I'll give you an actual example of, this anti-excellence. There's this example where we were down near the embassy. They were doing some kind of construction, and they had it all laid out, and this, people were kind of working, and then all of a sudden somebody yelled in Chinese, and I didn't know what he said, but the guy said that I was with, the translator said, "Hey, turn and watch." He said, "The foreman's coming. Watch what happens." And it was like something out of like a skit or something you'd see on TV, like scrambling in all directions, people just running and like finding something to do. And there was this one poor guy right in the middle of like he was in the ocean of nowhere to go, right? And so he's looking around frantic, trying to figure out something to do, and he doesn't know. So he grabs his hammer off of his belt and literally gets down on his knees and starts hitting the ground with the hammer. Like, just hitting the ground. And then the foreman comes over, and he's like, working hard, and then walks off. And he's like, he's satisfied with this, because it's like, not my problem. Is the whole.
Where was this again?
That was in Beijing, near the embassy, near the U.S. embassy.
Wow.
So in the city, properly. And so stuff like this happens. There are people whose job it is to be street sweepers, and they just tie brooms to the sides of their bicycles and pedal up and down the shoulder of the highway all day long, achieving nothing, literally achieving nothing. And that's their job. And I went to the bank one time, and I was getting money exchanged. And they were like, use the machine, because they didn't want to do it. And that's typical. And so I go to the machine, and I put my cash into the machine, and it ate my money. And so I went into the bank, and I went back in, I said, it ate my money. And they were like, we can't help you because it's Tuesday. And I was like, what? And they're like, we don't do that on Tuesday. And I was like, what? And they're like, no, you need to go to the other bank and ask them to get your money, and they'll give you your money. Just go to some other bank. And I was like, they're just trying to not do the job because they don't care. And eventually, I don't even speak Chinese, but I said something in Chinese, just kind of incidentally, to somebody else.
Yeah.
It was actually, I said "mei wen ti," somebody that said something, and no problem,
Right.
to somebody else, and then they got this like look on their face, like, oh shit, he speaks Chinese, and all of a sudden they're like getting my money. It was ridiculous. I mean, it was comically ridiculous that this happened, and this is pervasive. So at the same time, though, you have these business people there that are like off the charts serious, and their educational stuff. Like a friend of mine did an exchange year uh, in China, and he's like top of his class in his high school. I should say he's my friend's son, but whatever. I know him too. He's a bit young to say my friend, but he does this exchange year, and he's like top of his class in an American high school, smart kid. And it's like they took him in the math class. They had some there's constant competitions, like math competitions and things in their schools. And they took this kid, and he's like 17, brilliant, like a freaking genius kid. Top of his, literally, he graduated valedictorian. And they had to put him with fifth graders because the Chinese fifth graders were just owning him in mathematics, just killing him. And like that's like, so we're talking a senior in high school at the top of his game in America goes, and like Chinese fifth graders are just wiping the floor with him in these math competitions. So there's at the educational side of things for people who are not expected to end up in the bitter work category.
Yeah. Right.
It's insane culture of excellence.
Yeah. And that's that. And just to kind of give some context on this, what you were talking about with regards to the bitter work reminds me of a memoir called Spider Eaters about a woman in China during the Cultural Revolution. Basically, during this middle school, she was required, she and her classmates were required as part of the Cultural Revolution's Maoist ideals. She was required to move a brick from a large brick, probably about 20 pounds, from one end of the gym to the other end of the gym, put it down, move that same brick from that end back to the current end of the gym, and do that for 2 or 3 hours a day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that was revolutionary training.
Yeah. So this is interesting because, I train this martial art. I don't know a lot about this outside of the one context that I have. So my teacher's teacher, I mean, my teacher was born during the Cultural Revolution, but his teacher lived through it, obviously. And Mao, of course, did this whole thing like he was going to purge all of the culture of excellence, right? All of the old things, the
intellectuals.
They had to get rid of the sujio, the four olds, and so old culture, old customs, old values, old ways of thinking, or something like that, if I remember right. And so they have relayed, like my teacher's teacher had this whole like litany of complaints. He died a number of years ago. I never met him, but he had this whole litany of complaints about how China used to be hard, and Mao made everybody soft by making them do silly stuff like that, rather than. So this is especially within like the martial arts world. They were especially salty about this because used to have all these like great martial artists who wanted to show up and work hard and train hard, and then it was all this. The new attitude was just like, why? And so these guys are tough dudes, and that just got wrecked. And so, these cultural revolution things turn out not to be great. And I see kind of echoes of that, like the guy banging the ground with a hammer and the girl carrying the brick back and forth. That's the same story. The person riding their bicycle with brooms tied to the sides of it on the highway. I was like, is that real? I mean, what is going on there? And they're like, yeah, that person gets paid some peasant wage to do this. And then China gets to boast that it has 100% employment from, Beijing official CCP gets to boast, well, China is 100% employed. Well, you have people literally, and their job is to ride a bicycle back and forth with brooms tied to the side of it. I'm not exaggerating that. I've seen them. I've seen many of these people doing this. So, I mean, I've also seen some crazy stuff, like a slightly overweight kid literally riding like a bull on top of a like sewage truck or septic truck. Like he's just sitting, like he's probably like 11, like riding on top of this like tanker truck full of sewage. And it's like, all right, this is a different place. China's anything goes, man. Yeah.
it's funny tying it all together. You know how you were talking about Appalachian culture, and they really believe in hard work, but they don't put their bets in the right things, and so their hard work, they kind of work for not useless things, but very inefficiently.
Right.
And it's like,
and if that makes you happy, do it. But
yeah,
if you're dragging your kids into it, and forcing them into it with these kind of emotionally manipulative arguments, that's a problem.
But in China, even the semblance of hard work is gone in some of these people.
Unless you're going into either the big business that they have allowed only in the past 20 years, or if you're going into party service, in which case there's high levels.
Yeah, which is really interesting to me, because I know how competitive China's examinations system is, for high schoolers. I know in part, why some of these fifth graders can school your 17-year-old friend, valedictorian friend in math, because they're training for it from the age of 3. Or maybe earlier, or those kinds of things. Because a lot of Chinese people who see these examples that you have seen yourself, who've seen it with their own eyes, they don't want their children to live like that.
Nope.
So they want their children to get a good education. And because there aren't a lot of truly elite universities in China, it becomes incredibly, incredibly competitive.
Right. And the split is night and day. Like you have, as the show is called, Crazy Rich Asians on the one hand. Then if you see the bitter workers, it's like, that's not a life anybody wants for their children. Like nobody on earth would want that for their kids.
But in a way, to be on the other end of that cycle, at least in childhood, can't be exactly a super pleasant experience either. I mean, I know myself, it wasn't a pleasant experience for the immigrants and that's why I think a lot of Chinese immigrants want to come to America. Because they see, they see that ruthless culture in China, and they see those two sides, and they see those two worlds, and they see what it takes and what they have to do and how they have to compete. And they want to come to America because maybe they want to seek maybe a better opportunity for themselves.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Because I think this is the forgotten part of the American story that we're all screaming about right now, is land of opportunity. And there's an old saying, of course, people have heard a proverb, really, that chance favors a prepared mind. When we talk about things like merit and meritocracy, not being full, of course, human beings are social animals, so we tend to favor people. We also only know the people we know. We tend to give more favoritism to people than we should when we know them. And so there are corruptions to meritocracy. There's also the fact that just plain luck. There are extraordinarily talented people who are being overlooked, and there are extraordinarily untalented people who are in the right place at the right time. The saying that chance favors a prepared mind, whether that's hard work or whether that's hard study is a form of hard work. What that does is that when you put in the work, what meritocracy boils down to in the real world is that people who have the merit increase the probability that they'll be in the right place at the right time. And sometimes people are going to be in the right place at the right time anyway, and they win when they shouldn't. Yeah. And sometimes people are just they just keep missing the boat, and that's really sucks, because it sucks for them, obviously, and it also sucks that we're underutilizing brilliant talent.
And that raises an excellent point, because as we've talked about before, just because you work hard doesn't mean you're necessarily going to become successful. So, but if you live in a system that has, I guess, gives you a tolerance for failure, and I would say Chinese society in China has very little tolerance for failure because of how the competition culture just drives up and up and up and up and up.
Right.
But if you live in a society, I think, where you can at least have the right to fail, and you can get back on your feet, and that is a land of opportunity.
Yep. I hear that.
It's not. I think that's something I would have to stew on a little more, and maybe for a future conversation, talk about meritocracy and failure, and I guess truly what makes America an attractive land, and whether we're losing those values?
I'm afraid that we are, frankly. I really am afraid that we are. I really actually fear that we're making in a very American way, rather than obviously a Chinese way, that we're making the same mistakes, or some of the same mistakes of the Cultural Revolution now, but again, shaped like in an America shaped way rather than a China shaped way. So it does make me feel concerned. You very much have this ability right now to advance yourself by spouting the right ideology, which is exactly the same thing that was going on. We're doing revolutionary work where you carry a brick back and forth until you learn to say the right ideology, and then you don't have to carry the brick anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
That is true. That is true. It's and just to posit a hypothesis, maybe this ideological activist scholarship that you've been talking about, especially in your book, Cynical Theories, perhaps this activist scholarship, they feel, when you bet your career on this, it's like you're carrying that brick with you, and you have to just carry it with you all the time.
Oh yeah. I don't think actually that they have the ability to put it down after you carry it long enough, right? It's like it is the only like, I don't know a good way to put this, but without going into an analogy or a different paradigm. But for example, one of the things that I learned when I was doing some research about the anti-vax movement back several years ago, was that one of the reasons that there's reportedly this huge backfire effect. You try to provide parents vaccinating anti-vax parents with scientific facts about the vaccines, and it makes them more anti-vax. It backfires. It goes the opposite direction. And one of the reasons that some, I think, very brilliant cognitive scientists and psychologists were able to kind of suss out is that for somebody who's been doing so, if you're wrong about vaccines and you're an anti-vaxxer, right? You at that point will have to admit that you've been doing harm to your child. And that's a hard thing to do psychologically, to admit that you've been harming somebody that you love, to the degree where you're willing to take that kind of a risk, or to take that kind of a stand. Because I think that's ultimately anti-vax in the older sense, not talking about the COVID vaccine. That movement was actually rooted in kind of this overprotective love for your child. And so now you have to admit that the thing that you care most about, that you've been doing the opposite. You've been hurting or putting your child at risk when you thought you were protecting your child. And so anywhere you have this kind of thing, so for like this grievance scholarship, the people who have bet their careers on this, for them to admit that they were wrong requires them to say, I've not only been engaged in a bunch of bogus stuff, which is hard to admit, my credentials are based in that. That's harder to admit. And it's probably been doing harm to society. And so it takes an incredible amount of emotional and psychological maturity to be able to reach a place where you can do that. So once you pick up the brick, if you will, for long enough, it's very difficult to put down, because you've been now complicit in something that's fraudulent. It's much easier to project outward and say, oh no, we live in a society of whiteness and everybody else is complicit, and I'm the one who's not complicit in something that's backwards and wrong. And it's psychologically going to be very, very difficult for people who have invested themselves into this ideology to step back from it, mostly because it's so transparently absurd. I mean, you have to admit that you got tricked, which nobody wants to do. To come out and say, well, I took this up and I got all into it. You have to admit to anybody that knows you and that knows you were involved in it, that you got tricked. And nobody wants to be that person. Nobody wants to have to admit, oh man, I totally got taken in hook, line, and sinker by this thing that's like really obviously not good. And nobody wants to be that person.
Exactly. Well, my guest is James Lindsay, author of Cynical Theories. James, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about this with you in a different. This is a very different kind of conversation that I normally get to have, and so I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you about this. Looking forward to your book as well. I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, I'm excited about it too. Well, glad to get on the podcast with you, and thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I ever got a sense of the racial narrative in this country, especially among the academic left, I was in college, and I was a sophomore in college, and actually I was at this residence hall, and there was this residence life counselor there, and she was this big social justice warrior. And one of the things that she did as part of our bonding activity for our hall was she asked us to participate in this session where all of us would come in and bring elements of our cultural upbringing. So, I was always a little bit of a rebel, a little bit of a challenger. I didn't see, obviously I hadn't seen the world yet. I was still a sophomore in college. I hadn't seen what she was trying to imply, but I wanted to do something funny. So, I lived in a pretty multicultural hall, and, there's people who brought in different things. The Mexicans brought in some Mexican stuff, and I remember the Koreans brought in some noodles. And, some people who were white, brought some things from their own, Anglo or heritage or those kinds of things. But I was an Asian American, and particularly I was a Chinese American. So I knew what was expected of me to bring this, but I decided that I was going to subvert that a little bit. So she called on me. I was one of the last people I remember. And I came up to the stage and I said, "Hi, my name is Kenny Xu. For my elements of my cultural heritage, these are what I brought." And then I showed them what I brought. I said I brought a Constitution, and I showed them my Constitution. I brought my American flag, my Redskins cap, and a paper target that I had shot at a shooting range. And my hall counselor, everybody was kind of laughing, having a little fun. And my hall counselor got really mad. Like, she got steadily more angry as I shared more elements of my cultural heritage, but I had a complete justification for it. I was born in America. I was raised in Richmond, Virginia. I fell in love with, a lot of elements of where I came from and where I lived. This was my culture. I'm an American, but my hall counselor, this ignorant hall counselor, did not seem to get the message. She came after me a little bit. So, I said, this is my Redskins cap. And she said, there are some people who think that name is offensive. And I said, well, it's funny because actually 9 out of 10 Native Americans don't actually think that the name Redskins is offensive. And by the way, that's still true today. We're talking about a very small, powerful minority of Native Americans who actually think the name is offensive whatsoever. And, she got that obviously displeased her. And then finally, when I showed my paper target that I shot, I said, I hang around these people all the time. Some people call them rednecks, but I just love shooting with them. They're such down to earth people. And then this is when she kind of exploded. She went in front of the entire classroom and she said, "Listen, there is a school of thought that thinks that that thinks that Asian people, meaning me, are actually white." And I just looked at her because I didn't know what to say. This is the first time I had ever heard anything remotely like this. I mean, I looked at myself in the mirror every day. I'm not white. And I said to her, "What do you mean? I'm not white?" And she said, "Well, you guys have the privileges of white immunity and being near whiteness." And, my hall counselor was neither. She was black. And I said, "Well, that's not how I think of myself at all. I'm obviously an Asian American. I'm proud to be Asian American, but I'm an American. I was raised here and I was born here, and I don't think that you should judge me based on my skin color." And that incident left a mark on me because that was the first time that I really saw that there was an ideology on college campuses today that was propagating the notion that people are divided by race. And not only that in a sense they should be divided by race. This whole idea that we need to divide people by race so we can treat them differently to ensure things like equity, or to ensure things like affirmative action, or to ensure things such that racial identity politics, I hated it. I thought it was odious. This was my sophomore year of college, and I just remembered to myself thinking, this is something that is sick. Because as an Asian American, fitting in within my high school, it wasn't easy. I wanted to be like the other people, particularly speaking, I wanted to be like the white people. Many Asian Americans are taught to hate themselves in that sense. And this is not helpful. This ideology is not helpful to basically align ourselves as white adjacent, even though in many senses, Asian Americans don't feel like they're white people at all. Many of them feel foreign. Many of them feel like they're outsiders. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. In fact, I think that we need to be able to challenge ourselves. If you're an Asian American listening to this, and sometimes maybe you feel alienated, you need to be able to challenge yourself, and you need to be able to say, okay, well, maybe we are a little different, but we should embrace that. We should embrace that difference. But at the same time, we should emphasize our own unique American heritage, right? And that's what I was trying to say. In this conversation with James Lindsay, James and I were talking about the model minority versus the not model majority. And it's funny how Asian Americans are viewed as the so-called model minority. Asian Americans are viewed as, I guess, the minority, especially, this is especially an academic left phenomenon. The left views Asian Americans as a minority that is, because we are high achieving, we're not really a minority in their eyes. We're not really people of color in their eyes, unless it's convenient for them, i.e., unless it's in the sense of racism. So when there was anti-Asian racism during the coronavirus pandemic, yes, of course, Asian Americans are minorities, we're oppressed, we're victims, those kinds of things. But in education, when Asian Americans actually outcompete white Americans in things like test scores and academic excellence, at that point, Asians aren't viewed as minorities anymore. They're actually viewed as part of the oppressor majority. Just take a look at the educational literature today. There's a Washington school district, and this is very common, that classified outcomes by race. And the way that they classified outcomes by race was that they put blacks and Hispanic outcomes on one side, and they put white and Asian outcomes on the other side. Since when were Asians lumped in with white people farther to the extent that black people are lumped in with white people? Some people make the argument, because Asians achieve on a level relative to whites, they should be classified with whites. But I see that as very arbitrary. Culturally speaking, there's a good argument to be made that black Americans have more in common with white Americans than Asian Americans do culturally, because simply speaking, they've been in this country longer and they've actually influenced this country for a longer period of time. Asian Americans are barely present in American culture right now, especially mainstream American culture. Whereas if you look at how black Americans have been able to influence things like rap music and movies and entertainment and culinary arts, well, maybe Asians have a little bit of strength in the culinary arts. But James Lindsay and I, we were talking about Asian Americans being the model minority. And then James was comparing that to his upbringing, or at least the edge of his upbringing, where he was around white Americans who were supposed to be the oppressor class, behaving as if they were not in that privileged class. Or not behaving, but they definitely are not in that privileged class. For example, James talked about, being raised in East Tennessee, and his mom and dad were teachers there. But he was right on the edge. He met a lot of rednecks, and he said, look, I liked hanging out with rednecks. They were just great people. They were down to earth, and they worked hard. And maybe in a sense, that's what they take pride in. They have honor in working hard and, devotion to family. But James then went on to critique them. They said they focus too much on family. Now, isn't that interesting? As conservatives, we like to believe in family values. A family is preeminent and most important. But in some sense, if your family chains you into the locus of community that you are and does not provide opportunities for you to expand beyond those opportunities, maybe in some sense you do have to make choices between your family and the wider world. especially when cultures are insular, like in East Tennessee, according to James. This white hillbilly culture worked hard. That's what James said. They worked hard, but at the same time, they didn't work as efficiently. See, what Asian Americans do, other than work hard, because of course Asian Americans do work very hard, largely speaking, especially academically, is that they place their bets on the right things, or on some conception of what the right thing is. And that right thing is education, is usually education related. They definitely always want to send their kids to college. You know, Vietnamese Americans, it's really interesting. 80% of them come here with not much English experience, very little English experience. But then in one generation, their kids become highly literate and go to college at a much higher rate than their parents did. Like, these are people who are like nail shop owners, you know, and their kids would grow up to be doctors. Like, one generation. That's how hard they work. But that's also the strength of the bets that they placed on their education. These white rednecks, or these white hillbilly people, worked very hard, but oftentimes it was pointless work. Pointless work in the sense that the work may not lead to anywhere all that special. You know, if you, James was talking about this businessman that he met who owned a housemaking company. And this housemaking company prided itself on doing everything by hand. And this businessman did everything by hand because he thought that was more pure. And I'm not saying that that's what every hillbilly businessman thinks, but he pointed to that as an extreme of what these people think. And that maybe you got to grow your own land and till your own soil. And maybe that's useful if you're, you know, in the Great Depression. But in today's economy, it does leave you behind. It does leave you behind. And I'm not saying that that's a just thing or an unjust thing, but I'm saying it probably does leave you behind if you try to do everything yourself. Another thing about pointless work. James was talking about going to China. You know, James goes to China every year to practice martial arts. And he would see people doing these pointless jobs. It's very interesting. He talked to me about the bicyclist who would go around and just have brooms attached to his bicycle and just sweep things very casually. Sweep things from one side to the other, and then sweep things from the other side back to that same side. And it reminded me of this book that I read called Spider Eaters, where this girl from the Cultural Revolution talked about her experiences in the indoctrination camps. And they would move bricks from one side of the gym to the other, and they would move bricks from that other side of the gym back to that side of the gym. That was the work they were kind of doing. It was work, but it was pointless. There was no goal. That's, in a sense, what Cultural Revolution thinking is about, right? In order to re-indoctrinate the mind, you have to stop believing in the value of hard work, because if you start believing in the value of hard work, you believe in some sense that you're an individual who can do things. And that's completely against the Cultural Revolution framework. The Cultural Revolution framework has to reject work, has to say your work is not necessarily valuable. We don't want self-reliance. We want reliance on us, on the state. We want your mind to change. And in 5 or 10 years in the Cultural Revolution, what Mao did to the Chinese psyche was amazing. You know, this is a land of over 1 billion people. It's a beautiful land with many amazing people. But he drove the intellectuals out of government. It was very anti-intellectual, this kind of movement. Not only very anti-capitalist, but it just even despised the value of education. And so what Mao did was he valued ideology and conformity to ideology over independent thinking and hard work. And that had a deep effect in the Chinese psyche that still lingers today. Because the whole idea of socialism and communism is, what's the incentive of working hard? And so there are a lot of people that don't work hard. And that leads me to think about American exceptionalism, right? Like, what makes America exceptional? And I will discuss this a little bit more in an upcoming podcast with a Venezuelan immigrant who's pretty popular in economic circles that I'm excited to show you. But I do want to talk a little bit about American exceptionalism, because James Lindsay was saying, yeah, they believed in hard work, but they just put it into pointless avenues. Well, in a sense, it's bad, yes, but at least they believe in the value of hard work, right? In America, you can't make it if you don't work hard. I mean, sure, there are some privileged people who are just born into wealthy families and then quickly spend all of their parents' money on lavish lifestyles. Sure, that exists. It's a very small minority, and usually their wealth dissipates in the span of 1 or 2 generations. Billions of dollars go completely to waste. In America, you cannot survive without hard work. And so what is the strength of America? Well, it's the ordinary people, and it's the excellence. I would call it ordinary excellence, right? Ordinary excellence. That's what has always kept America young. That people here really believe in the value of hard work and are willing to actually go out and achieve it. You know, I wanted to talk all about these ideas about hard work and pointless work and ordinary excellence, because I wanted to tie it back to the racial framework that I was talking a little bit about early on in this segment, where I was talking about my residence life counselor. And my residence life counselor really believed in this dichotomous view of race. There is the privileged and the oppressed. And the privileged people are the white people and increasingly Asian people, and the black people and Hispanic people are oppressed. But that dichotomy is falling on its shoulders because of this idea of hard work, right? Because the immigrant mentality has to reject this. If you actually come to this country, and you believe in this country, what do you believe? You believe that you'll be given a fair shot if you work hard. And that should extend beyond your race, right? Whether you come here and you're black, whether you come here and you're Asian, whether you come here and you're Latino. If you come here, you believe in some sense that this is a land of opportunity, even to those who are of the so-called wrong color or wrong race. This is what is being destroyed right now in academic circles. This value of hard work, this value of opportunity, because if you pin your success or your failure based on your race, then you will not be able to address the notion of your own hard work, or hard work is antithetical to the idea of some races perpetually being oppressed and some races being perpetually privileged. Asian Americans are the classic example of this. We're supposed to be in an oppressed class. Maybe the Marxist left would prefer that we're in an oppressed class. I mean, undoubtedly so. So we can get the victim points. But because of our hard work and because we place our bets in the right places, such as education, at least according to us, we do make sacrifices for that. But generally speaking, those sacrifices are tolerable. Because we work hard and because we place those bets, we are able to advance in society and achieve generational social mobility. Even though we are an oppressed class, even though 80% of Vietnamese immigrants can't even speak English when they come to this country, their children grow up and become doctors and lawyers. And I'm not just talking about elite Asian Americans either. I'm talking about ordinary Asian Americans. There are Chinese Americans in New York City right now who are shopkeep owners and who are small business owners and restaurateurs. Don't make that much money. They see education as their opportunity for advancement, so they train their kids really hard to study for tests. And their kids do really well, and they go on to achieve generational social mobility because they work really hard and they place their bets in the right places. And I even want to circle back to something that's not even Asian related at all. I want to talk about Hispanic Americans. We look at Hispanic Americans right now and we say, oh, they make only, 2/3 of the average income of white Americans. Well, why is that? Is it because they're an oppressed class and they're oppressed by whites? Of course not. The majority of Hispanic immigrants right now, come from Mexico, and we know that, and they've come very recently. Whether legally or illegally, they've come here very recently. It takes a little while to build generational wealth, don't you think? It takes a little while. It doesn't take that long. In America, it actually takes a pretty short time. But yeah, if you're first generation, you come here, and there's a significant portion of Hispanic immigrants are just coming here, and they work low income jobs and labor for low work. So of course, they would drag the average Hispanic income down. But we're getting to the point now where there's a significant number of Hispanic immigrants who live in America today, who are second generation, who are third generation, who've married white people, who've married people, black people, who've married people of other races. They don't even classify themselves as Hispanic anymore. They don't even classify themselves as, Latino anymore. They would prefer to use the word white, or they would prefer to use the word American. I mean, this whole idea of dichotomizing people like this into an oppressed class is just antithetical to so many Hispanic American experiences. And, a following podcast will update you on that. But the notion of race as a replacement as a stand-in for hard work and being in a land of opportunities is just odious to me. It really is. And I think that's what, James and I going back and forth talking a little bit about culture. That's why it's so important, because you really need to talk about culture. What are your values? What do you value? What do you place your bets on? Just because you're white doesn't mean you're going to be rich. Just because you're Asian or just because you're a person of color doesn't mean you're going to be poor. A lot happens to you based on the cultural traits that you're able to acquire and based on the skills that you're able to develop. I just want to touch on one other thing in this podcast, and that is I want to talk about something that James said, in the sense that Asian Americans and white rednecks both inconvenience the racial narrative going on today, the racial identity politics ideology, the woke ideology narrative. And that's why, in some sense, they want to suppress both our voices. I mean, remember the reaction to Hillbilly Elegy? Remember how people, came after J.D. Vance for, talking about his own culture and talking about the people relying on welfare and getting by and using cell phones when they know they're on welfare checks, or using expensive cell phones when they know they're on welfare checks? I read that book. It was a moving book, because J.D. Vance only escaped the culture with the help of his tough-as-nails grandmother, okay? He had to find solace somewhere else beyond his culture. He couldn't just assimilate to his culture and succeed in law school. That just was not going to happen. Even though he was a smart guy, even though he was a bright kid, he couldn't succeed in the cultural environment that he was. So he had to go and find a separate culture environment, and he found that in his mama, his grandma. Culture matters, guys. Culture really matters. And to blame it all on race and to ignore culture is to spread an untruth. Same thing with Asian Americans, with how they're able to achieve a modicum of success in society, even though they're the wrong race, even though they're a person of color. What the left is trying to do right now to Asian Americans is that they're trying to assimilate them into either white adjacency. They're trying to say that they are white, like my hall counselor is. They're part of the oppressor race, or they just simply ignore them. And they just don't even include them at all. For all intents and purposes, they're not even a minority. They don't even exist. We inconvenience this leftist narrative. Asian Americans really do. And we need to understand where we are in the left's academic culture. We need to understand the consequences if Asian Americans actually embrace what the left is trying to say about race. Because if Asian Americans actually embrace what the left is trying to say about race, they will find themselves squeezed out so fast, except, of course, every 4 years when they need to get the Asian American vote out, to vote for Kamala and John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock and everything like that, of course. Then Asian Americans suddenly exist again. But largely speaking, and in the cultural narrative, Asian Americans are not helped by the left. They're suppressed. They're damaged by the left. And if Asian Americans are actually going to stand up for their rights and their culture, they need to reject what the left says about race, because it's not pretty for them. It's really not. You're listening to the Inconvenient Minority Podcast with your host, Kenny Hsu. I wanted to thank James Lindsay for coming on board, talking about his culture, doing a different sort of interview with me. If you like the content of this podcast, I'd ask you to subscribe and leave a review. Subscribe on all channels. Please leave a review. I'm trying to do this kind of work to interview, to talk, and to evaluate and to analyze the conversations that I've had with very different people coming from very different ideas. But all of us are trying to tackle this tough, very thorny issue of race, identity, and culture. And we're trying to do it from a perspective that isn't just infected by woke and left ideology. But at the same time, I believe that even people who aren't part of that ideology needs to understand race. I think that it's just too important in our culture today not to. So this podcast seeks to attempt to bridge that divide in information both on the left and the right. So leave a review, subscribe. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.